through how to create a direct manipulation photo montage in Adobe Photoshop. Direct manipulation, for our purposes, will just be describing principles that will be unpacked throughout this year in the virtual world. But we're talking about the notion of using singular photos, overlaying them in Photoshop in a separate document, arranging them, rotating, layering as necessary to create a new whole, a new singular artifact out of the many photographs. So what I'm going to use for this purposes is actually the sculpture I showed in a previous tutorial in class the other day. It's an Oteiza sculpture, hence the name of the folder here that I've got on my desktop that has 10 photographs in it. I've got these photographs that are closer views of a sculpture that's sort of in rotation, in tension. And what I did was I rotated the camera while on site to align with midpoints of the photograph from the horizontal line going across the center photograph. I aligned and rotated with to be in parallel with one of the layers or legs of the sculpture itself. So you can see the rotation itself, picking up on the lines that were sort of given to me from my vantage point. So the photos actually rotate around and begin to describe certain pieces. At the time, I didn't know exactly what the whole would be, as we talked about in class. I actually had an idea about the concept, but I wasn't sure exactly what I'd end up using as a whole. So what I can do now, though, is take these photographs that you'd have typically when you're about to move into this step, you'd want to have them already processed and set up the way you'd like them singularly for the whole. So these are, for all intents and purposes, finished photographs. And then I'm going to select all of them and actually open them in Photoshop. And now that I have these pieces in Photoshop, I'll actually be able to take the sort of series of these, bring them together in one document, layer them, and actually have this photo montage of the entire sculpture, if you will. So right now, as you can see, I've got these labeled Oteiza 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19. So there's my 10 images. So after I've opened these, I can actually start by creating a new document. And that document size, always good to be 300 dpi. In inches will be 36 inches wide, 24 inches high. That's what I'm giving myself as a constraint for this montage. And this sort of color sets, background white, really not as important right now for where you guys are in your education. We can talk more about the difference between RGB and CMYK color as the semester goes on. For our purposes and the sort of output we'll be doing this semester, not really concerned about you guys. You can pick one, it's fine. Plotters are synced to CMYK color, so we'll actually select that across, but it's not essential that you know everything about the sort of color modes in your education yet. And then I'm going to name this the Oteiza montage. So I'm creating this new file, and there it sits as a blank white sheet. You could make this color obviously whatever you want. For our purposes in this semester, it's always beneficial, right, to have this sort of clean slate behind. So as I go back, I'm going to start with Oteiza 10, and I'm going to first do select all. And see, select all, we'll come back to this. Select all is Command A as well, or Control A on the PC. Then I'm going to edit, copy, and then I'm going to go into my Oteiza montage, and I'm going to edit, paste, and there it sits. So if I go back now to 10, I can actually close out of this particular file. I've already copied it in, don't need that. So now I can go to Oteiza 11, and now instead of even going through the select pieces, through the menus up top here, I can do Command A for select all, Command C for copy, and then go over to my Oteiza montage and Command V for paste. And you see again, I've got my background, I've got layer 1, which is the first photograph of mine, layer 2 is the second photograph. You can name these, obviously, and rename these as necessary. For this purpose, I'm actually going to keep them as layers so you can see the direct correlation. Again, now I can close out of that particular photograph. Don't need that one anymore. And now again, I'm going to go back to Oteiza, and this is going to now repeat our steps that we talked about. Combining layer 3, can go back, close out, Command A, Command C, Command V, can go back, new next photo again, Command A, Command C, Command A, Command C, Command A, Command C, paste that in. And now my last one. Okay, so now we've got all the files layered in this drawing, and what we can first do now is take the layers now and play with transparency. And that's over here on the right, this opacity for each layer. So we're going to now change that all to 50% for each layer. And you see what it's doing is creating, you can start to see things start to layer, literally creates a film-like quality to the layers. And obviously the more opacity you give the layer, the more you can see through it. For the purposes of this tutorial right now and what you're working on, 50% should be satisfactory to still allow you to see the layer itself and the layer behind it. We're going to start with a sort of given datum point, which we'll talk about in a second, and then work from there. So now that I've got these layers set up, you can start to see as I'll zoom in here, we've got an actual everything layered on top of each other creates this sort of somewhat holographic or just shifted effect, which in itself is can be quite intriguing depending on your interest in montage. For our purposes, though, I'm actually trying to reconstruct the image that I saw, if you will, the sort of visual piece, the sort of tension I was talking about upon arriving at the sculpture. So instead, I'm going to go back and you see on the left-hand side here, the sort of eyeball being sort of on, layers actually on and visible, right? So I'm actually going to turn off layer 2, layer 3, layer 4, and so on. And basically everything except for the background and layer 1 will be off. So as I zoom back out, what I'll do is I'll actually take layer 1, and I know that this is the quote-unquote bottom right of my image. It's the bottom right leg. It was my organizing structure. So I know everything's going to grow over to the left-hand side and up from it. So now that I have that as a constant, it's always good to sort of pick a constant in your montage. That's going to be my sort of horizon line for the universe, right? I can use the literal horizon line, but I'm going to use this photograph as my horizon. That's sort of the guiding point throughout that I'll come back to. So now as I turn on one at a time, I'll turn on layer 2. And you see layer 2 is rotated. So if I go and make sure I'm active, you know, that layer is highlighted over here. So layer 1 is turned on, but layer 2 is there. I can go through. When I've got my selection tool, I can move it around. Left click, drag, right, that you guys have played with already. But you notice I'm rotated, right? There's the horizon line, and we know it's somewhere around here in this photograph. So now, through transforming, which for our purposes, again, in this part of the course, you only need to understand transform as a tool that, yes, you can find it up here, but for our purposes, it's really important to understand some of the key commands as you go through. Is Command T makes that layer that's selected come up with this series of grips and prompts. And you notice one of them is a sort of stretch command. So again, holding shift, you can stretch in proportion, you can stretch horizontally, stretch vertically, play with those. But for this purpose, and what we're trying to do is actually we want to rotate. And you can see that rotation here shows up as this sort of curled arrow. You can see in the center, and it's somewhere around the side of the, as you turn a corner, it shows up as something you can actually play with. And you notice first it's a 90-degree rotation, then it's a more free-formed icon. And for our purposes, right, I just want to use a free-formed icon because I don't know the exact angle, but I know I need to rotate in a degree set going down in clockwise, if you will, right? So rotating clockwise. And I also know that this pole is somewhere here, and so is this leg, right? So once I have this element, I can start to drag it over the top. And now I'll zoom in. And you can see that what I can do now with the arrow keys is actually nudge this photograph around. And I actually got pretty close. So you can see I'm pretty close. There's actually going to be some overlap here. But for our purposes, again, in this montage, I'm trying to basically just connect that edge. I can always tweak it a little bit later, but I've got that edge. There will inevitably be some distortion, and that's intended with the montage. And so you can see, again, there's some edges here that are a little bit, I'll zoom a little further. You can see there's some edges that aren't going to quite overlap. Once you pick one, it's good to stick with it for a while and learn. And that's the beauty of the digital tools, that you can always readjust quite quickly. You hit enter to confirm your transformation. So now it is a locked in piece of the layer. And now I'll turn on layer 3. And again, layer 3, oh, sorry, let me undo there. Layer 3, make sure I'm active on that layer, again with my select tool. Layer 3, you'll notice, is actually being somewhat back to rotation that's slightly counterclockwise to up and down, right? That leg, which is pretty much vertical here, is actually rotated in that system. So what I can do is start to get close. If I want to overlay this piece, right? I can now use my Command T again, and through that system, right, get somewhat straight up and down. Again, it's going to be a bit of a guess to start with, right? It's going to be somewhat of a feel, which is actually the great part about this tool. And again, you see my edge here. Might want to actually use that as a guiding point. So maybe I want to come back up and be straighter on that side. Again, enter to confirm. You can do that at any step you want, but now there we have it. And I'm using my arrow keys, right, to nudge up and down. So that's pretty close. But you see, again, the middle is going to start to have a lot of tension to it. You can start to see there's already going to be 3 different sort of planes intersecting each other with the vanishing point. And that's, again, to repeat, quite understandable and actually part of the intention of a montage. Talks about it. So now I've got layer 4 turned on. And again, you see layer 4 is slightly higher and still rotated up top there, right? So I can go back up here, can get my transform tool again, begin to rotate, rotating counterclockwise again, getting close to that rotation, enter to confirm it. And again, come down and align. And now turn back on layer 5. Now layer 5 again has here, show, you can see I'm now rotated the other direction, where I've got to now come back clockwise, right? That leg needs to be rotated clockwise to be vertical there. So I can take this, get somewhere close, enter to confirm it. Now I'll come back down. And again, this is going to be somewhat of a series of choices that I'll have as the author. So I'm now going to, for our purposes, use this line up top and align with that angle, see what that does for me. And you can see where I'm already starting to give in to some sort of rotational aspect of the project is going to be misaligned, right? So now that sort of shadowed in there, you can see where I'm off here, but I've actually got this corner pegged down. I'm also splayed out this way, but that's again a process of this distortion that happens. Turn on layer 6. You can see layer 6 is actually even more of a rotation needed in the clockwise fashion to come back, being sort of aligned with this particular montage I'm doing. So that sequence actually begins to overlap pretty much within the void, which we'll talk about in a second, where it's actually starting to show some deviation up here in there, and it might not be quote unquote necessary to describe the space, so I may choose to turn certain of these layers back off. But what I'm trying to do right now is get close enough so that I can start to figure out which photographs are needed for the intent I'm after. So now I've got starting to describe the side of this element. So again, using transparency here, you can start to see that almost aligned. You got to probably rotate a little bit more. Again, you can always turn back on that transform just by Command T in the layer you want active, nudging back and forth. But now you start to see where it started give and take here, where I'm probably looking at this mark on the metal here in that system. So I might want to rotate back up to realign. Again, pretty close, so see some left there. And then I'll just finish out, it's going to end up being the upper corner. So I turn on layer 8 here. You see layer 8 is going to start to be the upper right corner of the photograph of the montage itself, sculpture. So this one actually has to rotate again in the clockwise fashion to align with this piece, but it's going to also want to intersect across with this form of the sculpture, right? So there's actually some give and take going to happen here. as I'm starting to layer, you can at any point turn layers on and off, obviously down here to make your reality more more grounded, I guess we should say, because it can become a little bit confusing. For the purpose of this tutorial, I actually want to show you the process of the layers themselves just by the transparency. And then now, as I've got the upper corner again of the sculpture, start to see where I've got to rotate ever so slightly, not a major angle shift here, right, to get this being aligned. But I'm starting to capture more of the sky again, but the reconciliation of the form, now that I'm on my 9th layer of this montage in such a tight area, you start to have to give away certain aspects of it. But I'm trying to keep the edges somewhat aligned. That's my purpose as the sort of author here, and let the middle sort of be the mess, the intersection of all the principles. And then lastly, got this piece that sort of captures the leg again, which maybe you might find out is actually quite redundant of a layer, but we can set it back in. And sure enough, kind of proves itself as being somewhat of an overlap, but can start to become pretty powerful in itself then, of maybe unifying the image depending on what I'm after. So now that I've got my layers arranged, you can see the rotations that have happened along the way, with the first one being my sort of 0 point, and then everything that's sort of set off from it. This is exactly what I was after with the image. I was quite interested in sort of showing the kinetic form of that, the energy in the interior of the sculpture, the two blades grounded on the side, and then again by picking rotations of my camera by rotations in the sculpture presented to me, I think I was pretty successful in the intent of the grounding of the staircase sort of plinth that it's on, and then lastly the sort of energy that's at the center of the sculpture. So now I'll go back and through the transparency process, or opacity again, I'm going to turn my opacity back to 100. It's at this point you'll probably notice that some of the kinetic qualities start to diminish of the overlap, because something that's opaque on top of something else that's opaque doesn't show nearly the sort of tension. This may be exactly why the direct manipulation in Photoshop would be a more successful way to talk about this system than if it was completely tangible photographs in the reality as opposed to the virtual reality. That way you could go back and keep some of the transparency on. But as you see, right, there's somewhat of the world makes sense. You've got a double street light over here, got a shift in this light over here. This tree doesn't quite connect itself, but again describes the space. And really what I have is this staircase grows up into this form, and then it starts to distort itself as if I'm seeing it in multiple times, right? Even though it's basically from the same vantage point, right? I didn't move myself. I just rotated the camera from the view to sort of capture this thing. And again, the white space here is intentional. I wasn't interested in capturing anything that wasn't the sculpture, and this datum was a sort of given. And so that's why I started with the right-hand side of the photograph and built out. What you can start to do, though, is turn off certain layers. So I know I want layer 1 here to sort of ground me. Maybe layer 2 describes something pretty far out, but as I start to get into layer 3, I can start to check, well, that's still describing a space that's out here. Layer 4 still describes something above. Layer 5 is actually completely internal, so I might turn that one off. Layer 6 is actually something pretty much internal as well, so maybe I turn that one off. Layer 7 again is completely internal to the actual frame. I might turn that off. Layer 8 again is basically described my inside here, so maybe I turn that one off. Layer 9 actually is the upper portion of the sky, so maybe I like that piece. And then layer 10 is actually a complete overlap as well. So I can start to use that to my advantage by masking certain overlaps or regions, or turn that off. So again, if I come back and turn off layer 10, maybe I also would study turning off back here this layer as well, right? So layer 3 had some overlap. So this was to be the least amount of photographs I would need to fully visualize the sculpture. And you notice the less photographs you have, the less distortion you have to deal with, right? Because there's less pieces to have to align and arrange. What I would encourage is that you would always use as many photos as you deem worthy of being processed to start for the montage and then edit out afterwards. But also because of the sort of system that's involved, you actually don't have to worry about with your particular authorship, right? You don't have to worry that that piece isn't aligned and that piece is, right? So that if I come back here and see that layer 4, if I start to shift this a little bit and I'll zoom in, so layer 4 is this one up here, I can actually start to see that by privileging that edge over on this side, I actually am misaligned slightly here and then inside this space as well. And again, the same thing goes for layer 9 up here on the right. As I start to shift that over to align, I'm getting to start to overlap, and how much am I willing to sacrifice in that process, right? So there's actually something to be said for working through this in the subtle ways. So as I rotate a little bit again, I might as well rotate a degree or so to realign that piece in this bottom corner. Again, what I give up here is a slight misalignment, but it's all in sort of service of, in my process, what I've used is trying to align the edges of the photograph. There's the edges of the sculpture, excuse me. So this edge is aligned, this edge is aligned. And of course I started with this sort of ground, but what I've given up is this staircase starts to break away a little bit. Obviously the middle of the photograph shows the intersection of these pieces. And really what I have turned on is, not excluding the background, which is again this sort of given white, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 layers turned on to describe this particular element. As we know, I could always go back and change the opacity and put more layers in, but this to me was more the intent of what I was after. I didn't need more layers in the final product. I actually wanted to use the fewer layers to actually describe the tension in the middle. And certainly as the author of this photograph, that was a choice I made. There is no right or wrong. So again, to encourage when you're exploring montage and the sort of direct manipulation, use as many layers that you have available to you to describe the montage or the object or the focal point of the image first, and then begin to turn them off. You can always turn off a layer. It's very hard to visualize something that's not there. So you can always put it in first and then turn it off to visualize, rather than just guessing before you open. Hence why of the 10 photographs I had, I only used 4. So with this process, again, just to run through the tools themselves, we opened a series of photographs. We created a new document that was 24 by 36, again, just a given piece that I had at 300 dpi because, again, want to be as high a resolution as I can right now. I can always change that for printing later. And then through that, I used the Select All, Command A. Then I used the Command C of the particular photo, which is copy, right here. And then I went back into the montage file, the blank document I had, and edit, paste, or Command V into that file, and then repeated that through the other images I had opened to create the file set, and then through transform, which again has a series of options via the menu, but I want to encourage you guys to get familiar again with the key commands if you haven't already, which is Control T on the PC, Command T on the Mac, and that allowed me to rotate, play with the sort of image. And the only other layer manipulation we did, right, you can always change orders by dragging up and down as well, which is something you may want to play with in sequence. I actually biased by saying this was my bottom layer, and as I rotated clockwise from there, this was my top layer. I could, of course, drag things around to put layers behind other layers and so on, right, to sort of privilege certain things. For my purpose, did that. But really the layer manipulation I did was just this opacity up here. Each layer I made it 50% so that I could see through and align and take advantage of the digital direct manipulation as opposed to something that's truly opaque in reality. And then I turned that opacity back up to 100% to give the sort of a whole to the project. Again, to explicitly state that at the end that you must go back to 100% would be very reductive. I think you could certainly keep your opacity at 50% if you wanted to. So that's what I'll leave you with, the idea of how different this montage looks when I go back to those 4 layers and switch them to 50%, or maybe certain layers. But you could see how wildly different the image looks now that you start to see what areas of the photograph literally overlapped, where the sort of misalignments create a sort of motion in the middle, and that's a completely different image, something you could not get unless you printed on vellum or mylar. in a sort of a reality or an analog photo set. So the digital direct manipulation might allow this to be your final image. I encourage all of you, if you're working on the assignment, through this process, to maybe play with why you would turn the opacity back up to 100%. What does opacity 50% give you, and potentially print out both options or variations on those options to discuss with your classmates on Monday, so that then by the end of the week you could have an authored and reach the most intent that you were after in your montage by critiquing yourselves, throughout the week. So again, the process itself is actually as many layers as you deem necessary, but using Photoshop and the transparency tool, you could see how you can begin to command quite a few photos in one particular file and not be overwhelmed.